Part 5 of this series is about energy. Rob will cover our Cob Oven, how we heat our greenhouse with a rocket mass heater, how we heat water with solar thermal, and the heat recovery ventilation unit in our home.
So the second thing that we looked at was energy. We looked at all of the energy systems within our house and we started tackling them one by one. An energy source or consumption that people don't normally think about is how we go about cooking. So one of the first things that we built in our backyard was a Cob oven. Now a Cob oven is basically an outdoor oven made out of clay, sand, and straw. And they're very inexpensive to build, and they require a community to build it. And so we got a whole bunch of people together and we built this Cob oven in a day. And what we've found is that this oven takes in between 1 to 3 hours to heat up. And then you can cook for up to 6 hours. So whenever we fire up this Cob oven, we end up inviting a whole bunch of people over to come and use it with us. And so we haven't just created a new way of cooking that runs on biomass, specifically wood, but we've actually created a centerpiece within our property that actually encourages community to gather. Now, you're probably wondering, where are we getting the wood to heat this Cob oven? And it turns out that the amount of wood waste in the city is unbelievable. Every time a new house gets built, in between 2 and 5 massive containers of waste get sent to landfill. And a lot of that waste is wood waste that is totally either burnable or compostable. So if you just go around the city, you can actually harvest tons of urban lumber, and it's kiln dried, which means it's fantastic for burning in a space like this. So we have pizza parties, we cook our chicken and lamb and everything inside of this oven that we'd normally do inside. One of the other benefits of cooking outside, especially in the summertime, is that we don't end up heating our house up a ton when it's quite warm outside. So we end up spending more time outside, and it's a ton of fun to cook within this Cob oven. Before I got into permaculture, one of the things that I was doing for a living is I was working for a company that specialized in building passive homes. Specifically, they were building passive homes and low energy homes with something called SIPs, or structurally insulated panels. Now a SIP is essentially 2 layers of material. In this case it was magnesium oxide, and then styrofoam on the inside. So they're very efficient, they make building really quick, and because they're prefab, there's not very much waste. So one of the projects that I worked on there was the design of this passive solar greenhouse. In our backyard now, we've got this structure which is about 200 square feet, and it allows us to grow for about 3 seasons throughout the year. So now we take a break in the winter time, but we can get an early start in the spring, we get enhanced production in the summertime, and then we can keep our vegetables growing within this space right up until about November, December, depending on how the seasons fall. So a passive solar greenhouse is essentially a greenhouse that has glazing or glass on the south side of the building, and then it has insulation on the east, west, and north sides. And the reason we can use buildings like this in our climate is our climate gets really cold. We get down to -30, -40 on a regular basis in the wintertime, but we have an enormous amount of sun. So where you have a ton of sun, but you have very low amounts of temperature, we actually only need to have light coming in on one place of the greenhouse, which is the south side. These are quite a bit different than the glass houses or hoop houses that you're probably familiar with. Those glass houses and hoop houses were built or originally designed in Europe, where they have very low light levels in the wintertime and even in the spring and in the fall because of the amount of rain and cloud cover that they have. And so they have to compensate for those low light levels by actually glazing all of the sides of that space. Now, if we glaze all the sides of our greenhouse, what ends up happening is we end up with a ton of light, which is great for the plants, but glass is not very good at keeping heat inside of the building. And so we end up having to compensate for all of that heat loss going through the glass by having these huge heaters to keep it warm. A properly designed passive solar greenhouse should be able to stay above ambient temperature for the majority of the year with very little additional energy being placed into the greenhouse. So it's a very low energy way of growing food for 2, 3, or 4 seasons. Recently, we worked with Dirtcraft Natural Building. Their website is dirtcraft.ca, and we put in a rocket mass heater, which is a low-tech wood gasification heater that consumes waste wood, small chunks of either urban waste wood, or you can use small twigs, branches, and pine cones, things that normally people will look at as waste, and it burns it in a really efficient way. It's not just efficient though, it's also effective. So the beautiful thing with rocket mass heaters is that it only burns the tip of the wood, so the stove is only taking the amount of fuel that it can actually consume on a real-time basis, which means that we don't over-fuel the fire, which can happen in those airtight stoves that we're also accustomed to. And then it burns it through a highly insulative combustion chamber. So the majority of the energy that is released during the combustion process gets reflected back into the actual flame front. So you get really high combustion temperatures and really low soot and pollutants. Once the fuel has been completely combusted, then it actually comes through a barrel, just a standard oil barrel, and that oil barrel releases the first stage of energy into the space. So that's kind of your quick heat. And then it gets ducted through a cob bench. Now again, cob is made out of clay, sand, and straw. And because the flue gases are so clean, the flue gases are allowed to travel through this duct, and they release their energy into this mass of a bench, and the bench slowly starts to warm up. And by the time the flue gases have gone all the way through the bench and they go out the wall, we've reduced the flue gases down to about 40 or 50 degrees Celsius, which means that we've now got a really efficient burn, and we've got a really effective capture of that heat. So typically these rockets will burn for about 3 hours. We'll burn them for about 3 hours until the bench gets nice and hot. Then we shut the stove off, and the bench will radiate heat back out into the space. Now for us, what this allows us to do is every day or 2 days, depending on how cold it is outside, we can come into our space, fire up the rocket for 2 or 3 hours, heat the bench up, and then walk away from that space for a couple of days and not worry about those really cold nights where we could just dip a little bit below zero. So it gives us season extension. The other nice thing about this greenhouse is that in the wintertime we can actually go out there and it becomes a bit of a sanctuary, a place for us to hang out, suntan, get a little bit of that vitamin D, and the rocket just takes the edge off of that. So if it's really cold outside, we can bring the temperature up within the greenhouse fairly easily. The other energy system that we placed onto the house was a solar hot water heater. So in this photo you can see the roof surface that we installed the solar hot water heater on. And what I'm doing there is using a tool called a solar pathfinder, which actually measures the solar radiation that we receive on an annualized basis to determine whether or not that was a good place to put a solar hot water heater. The solar hot water heater is an evacuated tube solar collector that we got from a company here in Calgary called Simple Solar. Now evacuated solar collectors are really efficient because the tubes that you can see there are actually vacuum tubes. And a vacuum is a perfect insulator, which means you don't lose any energy through it. So within the vacuum tube, there's small little copper pipes that are filled with a heat transfer fluid. And as the sun hits this vacuum tube, which has a selective surface on it, which means that it absorbs more radiation, it's designed specifically to absorb as much radiation from the sun as possible. It heats this little tube up inside the vacuum tube, which sends hot fluid up to the top manifold, which is what heats the water up within our house. So we get about 80 to 90% of our annual hot water met just by capturing energy from the sun. One of the neat things about this specific solar collector is it's got a photovoltaic panel on the top. And photovoltaic panels, if you're not familiar with that term, collect solar energy to generate electricity. This little PV panel collects solar energy to drive the pump that's on the solar collection unit in the basement. So when there's enough sun out to run the pump, there's also enough sun to heat these evacuated tubes up to heat the water up. One of the neat things about solar hot water, if you use it properly, is you can actually eliminate your gas bill entirely. So you can, with these panels, you end up having a little control panel in the basement, and you can actually see how the temperature in your hot water tank increases and decreases with use. So we can actually time our showers, or we can time when we do laundry based on when we have the most amount of solar energy within our tank. The limitations with these systems is they generally produce the least amount of energy in December, January, and February, which is usually when you need the most. So in order to make up the difference in those months, we have a backup gas tank which will boost the temperature up just a little bit so that it's still acceptable within the house. So we always have a supply of hot water. In those months, what we find is the water will stay in between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is awesome because it means that the gas backup that we have only has to boost the temperature between 10, 15, or 20 degrees depending on the day. Inside the house, because we retrofitted the walls and we increased the air tightness of the building, we had to put something called a heat recovery ventilator, which is now a common appliance within a house. What this heat recovery ventilator does is it actually takes fresh air from the outside into the building, and it captures all the stale air from places like the bathroom and the kitchen, and it takes the heat from the stale air and it transfers it over to the fresh air coming into the house, so that we constantly have recirculating fresh air in the building, but we're not losing all the energy from that stale air that normally would just get dumped outside. So this dramatically increases the efficiency while improving the indoor air quality of our house.